Good afternoon again, everyone. How are you?
Good afternoon.
I love that we have a lot of Henry Street history and present and future in the room all at once. My name is David Garza. I'm the president and CEO here at Henry Street Settlement, and I've had the good fortune to serve this settlement and this community for the last 23 plus years. So really grateful to be with you all here today. For this really important third out of three come to the third out of four come to the table events, literally coming to the table. And this room has hosted come to the table events since, what year did we acquire this side of the house? 1907. Since 1907. So for the last 117 years, we've been here coming to the table to talk about really, really important issues. Today's objective is to cover the last 90 years, like the Henry Street settlement after Lillian Wald. So really the last 90 years, Lillian herself covered the first 30, and we're gonna cover the next 90 here today in 60 minutes. So that means we've got about 45 seconds per year, right, to really get us up to speed. But the reality of Henry Street and our settlement is that we do what we can to responsibly embrace our history to shine a light on our future. And we're an organization that's really, really fortunate to have so much organizational DNA that has proven over time to be timeless. And not only has it proven to be timeless, but it's proven to be progressively timeless. Now, all DNA, and all genetic material gets to evolve and change and adapt. But that is one of the core elements that we have. We have this ability to adapt and the ability to be agile and the ability to change with the times. And so unlike many organizations and initiatives and objectives and projects that started 131 years ago, we're still here. And because of all of you, we're still here going strong. So thank you for so many Henry Streeters here today. How about a round of applause for yourselves as Henry Streeters? Now, I kind of outed myself as being here for 23 years, but let's start with anyone, because there's a lot of team members in the room, so you should get a sense of the present and the future that's in the room, and some of the history. How many Henry Streeters in the room have been here 5 or less years? 5 or less years. Welcome, we say to Henry Street. You'll be the new ones, right? 5 or 100, you'll be the new ones. Okay. 10 years, or 5 to 10 years. 5 to 10 years. There we go. 5 to 10 years. We're going to keep going here. How about 10 to 15 years? There we go. Couple right in the middle. How about 15 to 20 years? There we go. How about 20 to 25 years? There we go. Anyway, Henry Street Settlement, we don't stop there. How about 25 to 30 years? There you go. You'd think we'd stop there, but we don't stop there either. How about 30 to 35 years? No one. How about 35 to 40 years? There you go. And with a different configuration or a different time of day, we could probably go to 40, 45, and so on. So the proof is in our reality. Right? We are the settlement's past, present, and future. And what I'd like to, I definitely want to welcome, all of our panelists, and they're going to introduce themselves. But I have an honor and an opportunity to introduce one of our panelists because I've had the real privilege of working with them as a partner for the entire time I've been at the Henry Street, literally since my first day at the settlement. I was standing next to this person, and today, my most current day at the settlement, I'm standing next to this person. And I refer to Debbie as my partner, right? Like it's kind of the matchup between partner and partner, right? Debbie is my partner in the work. And so I could not be more grateful and honored and proud to work with you, Debbie, on a day-to-day basis and share your vision for the community, share your commitment to the community, share your service to the community, and to sometimes blink really quickly when we're a little overwhelmed. So that's the thing we have. We kind of blink. So thank you for your decades of service to the settlement. All you do. We're honored to have you on this panel to talk about Henry Street in the last 90 years, of which you covered just about half of it. And if we go back to when you were a participant, you got even more. There we go. So I'll leave us with this, because I think of all of the timeless qualities that are progressive about us. What I think is critically important for us to be stewards of is our ability to listen to the community and then reflect on what the needs are and then act accordingly. And that is the most kind of timeless muscle memory that the settlement has, because if we're always listening to what's going on, we stay current. But if we also listen to what's preceded us, we can draw on that to be really effective in the day. So this notion of listening and reflecting and acting is a lot of what's happening today, right? We're going to listen to what's going on the last 90 years. We're going to reflect on it, and hopefully we'll be able to take some of what we learned here today into our work in the future. So welcome all of you, and welcome all of you to come to the table.
Thank you, David. That was a great introduction. And hi, everyone. I know most of you in the room. It's so good to see you. I'm Katie Vogel. I work as the public historian at Henry Street. Been here for 7 wonderful years. And we're going to be talking today about Henry Street after Lilienwald. So Lilienwald was the founder and director of Henry Street for 40 years, so from 1893, and she retired in 1933. So our panel today is going to move from 1933 up until very recent history. So that's a lot of history to cover in this next hour. So I just want to say, first of all, that we're going to talk through some major milestones in Henry Street's history, but there's no way we're going to be able to cover every incredible person that's had an impact on the settlement and all the different programs that have started over time. But what I'm hoping from this conversation is that maybe something you hear today sparks an idea, or that you want to learn more about something that you hear today. Or if there's something you really want to make sure gets brought up, then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So please, it doesn't have to be questions. You can also say something if you'd like, bring that into the space. So since we have so much to cover, we're going to actually go with our conversation up until about 1 o'clock, and then we're going to start the Q&A just for about 10 or 15 minutes. So if you do need to run to a meeting, I'll make sure to pause so you can head out. But first, so I'm with this incredible panel, Salonee Bhaman, Anna Duensing, and our very own legend at Henry Street, Debbie Cox. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves. They all have connections to Henry Street and the Lower East Side, and they're going to talk a bit about their work today and why they're on the panel. So let's start with Debbie Cox.
Hi, good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Debbie Cox, and I'm the Vice President for the Department of Integration and Community Engagement, the newest department in Henry Street Settlement. So I'm proud to say that. I want to get started with my involvement in Henry Street and when I first encountered Henry Street. But first, I want to just share something. So in 1968, at the age of 3, I attended daycare in 301 Henry Street. Yes, I know, a long time. And I brought proof today. I brought the proof, and my husband's here too. And I brought the proof to show you, and I know this is I'm not going to take long, trust me. It's the plastic bag. Okay, just open it and I brought the proof, so I wanted to show you. And I'll stand up for a minute. So, here's the proof. So this is me in 1969, running out of Henry Street, 301, filming a segment for Sesame Street in 1969. And the bottom picture is me when we filmed a segment in front of the firehouse, and so that's me on top of a firehouse. I don't know on top of the fire truck. So that's me there. So we can just pass this around so everybody can take a look. Yes, that's me in a green dress and a white bow, and that's why I have on a green dress today. So do you mind if I stand up? Because you don't mind if I stand up. Is that good that I stand up? So I want to say, so in 1981, I landed my first job, part-time job, working as a group leader at 40 Montgomery in an after-school program. At that time, I made $2.75. And I still have that application today, and I think I'm going to give it to Katie to put in a museum. In 1986, I landed my full-time job working at 301 Henry Street as a secretary to the late James H. Robinson. And then from there, I had many, many jobs. And I'm going to tell you, this is how many jobs I had. The list goes on and on and on, but I do want to share this funny story. One day I was typing, and the late James Robinson, who was the chief administrator, who started a lot of the youth programs over at Henry Street. It was called Youth Services back then. He called me into his office. I thought I was in trouble. And he was like, Debbie, I have a special assignment for you today. I have a special assignment to ask of you. And I was like, okay, what is that? You know, I'm all for it. He was like, we don't have a cook for the summer. So we're gonna need you to be the cook for the summer camp over at Fort Montgomery. And I was like, well, Jim, I'm sorry to say, I don't know how to cook. But I did the job because it was a need for the agency. I did the job, and I did it well. I've cooked fried chicken, never cooked fried chicken. I don't even know if I cleaned it right, but people are still alive to today. And I made it special where it was like a restaurant style. So the kids got to serve themselves. And so so the next year, I wasn't asked to be a cook. I mean, I did a good job, but I went over budget. So that's what happened. So that's just my start, and you'll hear more about it. Thank you, Katie.
And Debbie, you can hand the mic to her.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. A hard act to follow already. My name's Anna Duensing. I'm a historian. My work is about race and racism, social movements, and political radicalism in the 20th century United States. I teach at Villanova, which is just outside of Philly, but I am a New Yorker to the bone. And my initial connection to this neighborhood, I worked at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum for a decade as a researcher and tour guide, and over the years, and also true story, Katie Vogel has known me since I was 13 years old, and we've kind of grown into the historical profession together, but we've collaborated here at Henry Street on exhibitions, on curriculum development, and on some really special events that have happened in this space. So very honored to be here again. Oh, you've got a mic.
I have a mic of my own. Hi, everyone. I'm Salonee Bhaman. I'm also a historian, and I went to graduate school with Anna, actually. I studied the 20th century U.S. as well. My work is really about the kind of late 20th century. I studied the HIV/AIDS epidemic in New York City, and care work and social work during that era. I first came to Henry Street because Katie invited me to do a talk about steadies and crushes and Lillian Wald's sort of queer history. It must have been 2019, distinctly pre-pandemic time. But since then, we've worked together on the Queer History of the Lower East Side tour and the Queer History of the East Village tour, which we lead with our friend and colleague Daniel, who's also in the audience. I've worked through some Henry Street oral histories during the COVID project, and I'm so grateful to be here. I'll just echo that it's amazing that Henry Street has had such a commitment to history and thinking about history. I can't think of a lot of other organizations that have employed me so readily to talk about history that's so important to me. So I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you so much. Can't wait to get into talking. So we're going to roughly move chronologically and go from the 1930s to more recent history, go up to the present. But before we start going chronologically, I want to ask Debbie. Debbie, how would you kind of sum up what makes Henry Street so special? I mean, you've been part of Henry Street for decades and decades, and there's something that went from Lillian Wald's time that was so special about this place all the way up till now. What are some of those things that makes Henry Street so special?
Okay, that is a good question. And I'm gonna be a cook right now. And I have my ingredients. So I'm gonna read my ingredients. So for me, I think what's special about Henry Street is the people we serve. So we're gonna put that in a pot. The services that we offer, let's put that in a pot. The staff, the partnerships, the volunteers, our core values, Lillian Wald's blueprint. Okay, I don't have my glasses on. And we keep our doors open. And if we stir all that around, right, it's going to create a heart. But as every cook knows, you got to have that special ingredients. And if you put our CEO into that mix, our heart shines brighter. So that's why I think that's what, to me, that's why I think that we are here to this day, is that it's because of everybody, our community, and our CEO, and definitely our board members as well, when we have one here in the audience as well. So that's what that means to me.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great way to start. Okay, so we're going to start moving through history, and again, we're going to go at a pretty fast pace, but you can ask some questions at the end if there's anything you want to hear a little bit more about. So Lillian Wald, again, was director for 40 years, right, up until 1933, and she retired at that point, and she passed away in 1940. She was still connected with Henry Street in some ways at the end of her life. Hi, Lily. This dog, Lily, is named after Lillian Wald. She's so cute. Hi, Lily. So I'm going to start with Anna. Anna, I've heard you describe 1933, so that year that we had the changeover in leadership from Lillian Wald to Helen Hall, who was our next director. This was a year of so much change. You've talked about it as the worst year of the Great Depression. Can you talk a little bit about what was going on in the Lower East Side? I'm sure people have a sense of, the Great Depression's impact more widely, but let's get really local and talk about what was going on here in the Lower East Side. What is Helen Hall, as our second director, walking into, and what does she need to consider at this point?
So I will say, something I think a lot about in describing this moment is for us looking back at the past, it's really hard to isolate historical moments as lived experiences for people, us knowing what comes afterward. But I think the main thing to isolate 1933, right, as one of the most terrifying moments for everyday people, the extent of the uncertainty, right, the extent that, right, that there really was sort of widespread around the country and around the world a sense that the entire system of how the world operated had collapsed, and there was no guarantee of a future for anybody, right? And in terms of hard numbers, so on the eve of President FDR's inauguration in early 1933, a quarter of the country was unemployed. Millions were destitute, people who couldn't pay their mortgages, getting kicked out of their homes or kicked off their land. Certainly worse for people who were paying rent, right? The avariciousness and cruelty of landlords in that context, the desperation kind of flowing up and down, all of that intensified in a place like New York City. So if nationwide unemployment was 25%, in the city it was upwards of 33 to 38%. And then from there, right, we see that intensely concentrated in working class neighborhoods, and certainly from there, in immigrant and black neighborhoods. So the Lower East Side and Harlem especially just absolutely ravaged by this moment. And kind of looking at some of the, just to paint a picture, so there was a large Hooverville. These were encampments of unhoused and evicted people. There was a large one in Central Park, but there were at least 3 active in this neighborhood. One essentially where Sarah D. Roosevelt Park is, one on Houston Street that was called Packing House Row because people had built homes out of packing boxes, and then one that was sort of charmingly called Hard Lucksville on 10th Street at the East River. But I think the main thing is this is sort of before, this is the moment, this is a kind of national crisis where the question of sort of what is the state's obligation to its people is kind of coming into being. Up until that point, right, issues of addressing poverty were a conglomeration of a kind of paternalist government response, but mostly done by charities and kind of top-down charities that had a lot of cruel rhetoric about the deserving and the undeserving poor. But in this, and we will see this is the moment where the state is compelled to respond for the first time in US history and does in substantive ways. But in that vacuum where it takes a really long time for the people at the lowest rung to be affected by government programs, places like Henry Street are kind of uniquely poised to respond because they've been doing that work for a really long time. And I think the main thing to recognize, the stigma and cruelty and judgment surrounding, working class, Black and immigrant communities, despite then sort of these widespread effects affecting way more people, they continued on. And you see notions of the Lower East Side very much being the kind of undeserving poor, even in the context of this bleak economic and political reality. So the last thing I'll say, there's a crisis of just the economy in general. There's a crisis of housing, right? And I mean, I think the best way to envision that, one of the first kind of grassroots community responses that comes up in this period is sort of anti-eviction protests, where people in the community would show up, and when a landlord took people's furniture out of their apartment, they would move it back in, right? So this is sort of people on the ground in the streets doing this work. But I think, to kind of pull back and look at housing as a way to think about not only an economic crisis, but a public health crisis, so it's a social and cultural crisis more generally. And then on that note, I'm gonna kick it over to Salonee, because this is the moment that gives rise to eventually NYCHA and eventually a kind of large-scale government response to address the housing crisis. But paradoxically, or perhaps appropriately, it's also the era that gives rise to redlining and a kind of top-down state naming of neighborhoods like the Lower East Side in explicitly racist terms as being declining or hazardous, and shaping tens of thousands of people's fates for the worse accordingly. So again, Henry Street has already been doing this work, right? They don't need to pivot in this profound way, but I'll let Salonee say more about the issue of housing in particular.
Well, I'll just be very brief as a kind of historian of housing, but like Anna said, it's sometimes hard to periodize things as starting in a certain year or only beginning in a certain time. And before this 1933 crisis moment, I was reading The House on Henry Street really briefly, and there's interviews with Helen Hall where she talks about how at Henry Street they had understood that the Great Depression was going to be really bad for years prior to that, because they had noticed people that they served having their hours reduced, or things getting slowly worse before they became a crisis. And I think the redlining story is very similar, where this is one of the first areas where you have large-scale public housing being built and large-scale, quote-unquote, slum clearance initiatives, displacing people from where they live. And so there's this moment of promise. Could there be better quality housing? Could there be a different kind of promise that the state makes to people that they will be securely housed? But also a big question about what the value of these neighborhoods are. And as the federal government starts getting involved in kind of labeling certain areas as worthy of investment and certain areas as not, the Lower East Side is sort of redlined as a place where the Federal Housing Administration is not going to give people loans to fix up their buildings or allow people to buy homes and things like that. So it becomes marked in a very particular way that we'll see, I think, throughout the 90 years we're about to speed through.
Thank you. That was really helpful and really succinct. So, we're talking about the 30s and early 40s, and, this is Helen Hall's time. She's our second director, right? She was at Henry Street for 34 years, almost as long as Lillian Wald. And so much happened in this first, decade and a half that she was the director. And I'll just list a few of the things. We really, honestly, could have an entire panel about each of these things, but I just want to mention a few. So 1934 and 1935, she was actually on a 23-member committee advising on Social Security legislation to Franklin D. Roosevelt. So here's a point where Henry Street, is working on this really local level and also nationwide has this influence. Also, Helen Hall was taking up Lillian Wald's baton and advocating for public housing. And, the Vladeck houses are some of the earliest public housing in the entire country. Built in 1940, and Henry Street's had this relationship with the Vladeck houses since they were built and continues to today with a lot of our older adult services. Also, Helen Hall is the director when this country is moving through World War II, and a lot of Lower East Siders are going to fight in World War II. Also, a big turning point in Henry Street's history is 1944. Because that's when our visiting nurses service, Henry Street's nurses, actually split off and become a separate organization, the Visiting Nurses Service of New York. And this is a big turning point for Henry Street really starting to focus on social services as the main thing that Henry Street does. So just a little extra Henry Street specific context, but I want to get back to, 1940s to the 1960s. This is a time of really big change in the Lower East Side in terms of the immigrant and migrant communities that are living here. And I just wanted to ask, can you speak a bit about the shift, this shift in time and some of the factors that Henry Street leaders at this point have to consider to make sure to provide services in a way that makes sense to the community that's living here now, 1940s to the 60s? I think, Anna, you said you wanted to speak first and Salonee was gonna follow up.
So I'll just do, a little bit there. So the joke is historians are always like, this decade was an age of profound change, and it really always was. But I'd say the 40s, 50s moment, the first thing is this is the kind of early rumblings of white flight, and a kind of upwardly mobile, previously kind of working class, maybe second generation Jewish and Italian immigrant communities leaving the city, or alternatively, you see the construction of something like the Seward Park co-ops, which was backed by labor unions, but was really intentionally meant to be owner-occupied, middle-income cooperative housing for that kind of upwardly mobile white population. And then you have at the same time demographic shifts where you have this the beginnings of an influx of migrants from Puerto Rico coming to the city in large numbers for the first time, combined with the kind of early second wave of the Great Migration of Black Southerners to northern cities. And a lot of that is going to the West Coast, but New York continues to be a major hub. And again, you have this question of, coming up again and again, sort of who does the city serve, who counts as a citizen, and which neighborhoods are worthy of services, both at the sort of local, state, and federal level. So again, a place where Henry Street can really kind of rise to the occasion is sort of acting and moving and thinking from the bottom up, from the local level, right? It's not sort of charts and data from the federal government looking down. It's people in the community, understanding the community and serving the community, sort of being the front lines. But I'll let Salonee say a little bit more from here.
Yeah, I know, Salonee, you wanted to speak a bit about Mobilization for Youth, which was founded in 1957.
Yeah, I'll talk just a little bit about MFY, Mobilization for Youth, because I love learning about it and I love teaching about it to my students, because Mobilization for Youth is such an interesting organization. It's kind of started at Henry Street as part of a demonstration program, because in the 1950s, the big concern among many federal administrators is juvenile delinquency. This idea that young people are turning to crime, people don't know what's causing it. There's great fear that there are these new immigrant populations in places like the Lower East Side. And two Columbia social workers essentially come down and they propose this program where they will have like a jobs program that Henry Street will help run, that will work with low-income youth. And Mobilization for Youth is a pretty open, innovative thing. They're kind of experimental. They're not meant to last for more than a few years when they're first. It's a demonstration project, right? So they're going to try a few things using Henry Street as a container. Helen Hall is on their board. But what they find very quickly is that when they're actually talking to people who are part of Henry Street's community, it's not just that juvenile delinquency is some abstract notion. They start to find that the problems that are really affecting people are that they are living in substandard housing, that their landlords are not actually turning on the heat overnight. So students are having trouble staying awake in class. People don't have enough food to eat. So there's this far more nuanced idea of what people need to change about their lives in order to be kind of more full members of society. And it's not simply that they need to shape up, but it's that they need help and they need services and they need legal services. So Mobilization for Youth essentially becomes one of the first kind of legal aid, legal services kind of groups in the country. They start suing landlords, they start organizing tenants, they start pushing the school board to be more responsive to the needs of Black and Puerto Rican mothers especially. They call out racism in classrooms. So they're kind of this subversive program, and I think they're kind of an interesting vehicle to get us into the 60s and what we think about as sort of the like radical 60s. But they started at Henry Street in 1957, which is kind of an earlier era than we often imagine that kind of like really forward-thinking, like wraparound service actually happening.
Thank you. That was great. I learned a lot more about mobilization for youth from you. Thank you. So Debbie, you said your first, the first program you were a part of at Henry Street was 1968. Is that right? With
daycare.
With
the
daycare. So you were.
I
it's
wasn't here when
amazing.
Lillian Wall was here.
No. But Helen Hall was, let's see, director up until 1967. So, and then Bertram Beck after. So tell us a little bit about, you were really young at this point, but growing up in the neighborhood in the 60s and the 70s, and what was the neighborhood like? And also, what Henry Street programs did you participate in?
Okay, yes, I can definitely share that. I just want to say that I grew up in the LaGuardia houses in the New York Nitro development, right on Madison Street. Born and raised there with my 4 siblings and my mother and father. And at that time, the Nitro development was more like community, right? Families took care of families. They took care of each other. They took care of the apartments and even the hallways. We even decorated the hallways as one community, like sharing, and everybody decorated their doors. So at that time, it was really special. We were poor, but we did have a place to play. We went to the playgrounds outside, and outside the playgrounds had cement barrels and iron swings. And if you misstepped, you got injured. So I remember that. But and then that era also marked drug use, abandoned buildings, right? So of course, not like now where we can have a lot of tourists. We didn't have that. They were afraid to come to the Lower East Side actually. But then in being a participant at Henry Street, I then took a class with the legendary Rooftop at age 7, and took sewing classes, and I made and I can remember, I made a pot holder for my mother, and I remember there were different colors and stuff like that, and then I also took a ceramic class right here in 265, where I made my mother a blue ashtray, and she still have that ashtray to today, but she said, once you leave my apartment, everything here stays with me. You're not allowed to take anything out. So sorry, I couldn't show and tell today. So that's what it was. And, it was like family. So even going to the sewing classes, it was a lot of families there and a lot of children. So that was a safe haven for us to be there with our parents, but also learning. So that was like some great times that I can share with you back then. And I was young.
Yeah, and what was Henry Street's reputation like in the neighborhood? Did you find that like your neighbors also knew about Henry Street and were participating in programs too?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think Henry Street was like a Disneyland for services. So you can go to any building. So every building, we didn't have 18 buildings back then, but each building had a program that you can go to. 40 Montgomery had a cooking class. 265 had ceramic. We did sewing in 367, 301, and we did steel drum, karate. It was just a lot, double dutch. So it was just a lot of programs that really kept us off the street.
And I know you were very young at this point, but this is a time of just like so much activism, the civil rights movement, women's liberation, immigrant and migrant communities fighting for their voices to be heard in so many different ways. And did you feel that spirit of activism in the neighborhood growing up?
I think because I was very young, but what I do I don't remember, but I do remember one rally that my mother went to, and I don't know what it was about. And I asked her, my mother's 84, she couldn't remember, but I know that she took me with her, and it was all these families. It might have been mothers. I don't know what it was about. But then just knowing that I was with my mother and I know she was fighting for something, I was just happy to be outside that late. But yeah, so I do remember, like there was some stuff that, the neighborhood fought for. I don't know what it was, but.
Yeah, again, you were quite young at that point.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for sharing. We're going to get back to talking more about the programs that Debbie led in the 80s and 90s. But Anna, did you want to talk a little bit about some of the activism that was happening here in the Lower East Side in the 60s and 70s?
Sure. So, I think to kind of draw out what we've been talking about previously, by the 60s, one of the main ways the Lower East Side was struggling is that much of that old stock housing had been torn down, but nothing had been built in its place, right? So you sort of look at scenes of this neighborhood really from the 50s to the 90s, and people sort of say it looked like a bombed out city, vast empty lots, right? These are often where the kids go playing, and yet I think, again, the strategy you see of kind of like an organized civil rights response sort of in this vacuum is intensely local. And I think, when we think about a kind of mid-century heyday of the civil rights movement, the kind of 50s to 60s moment, for good reason, many people focus on the struggle in the Jim Crow South and the struggle to kind of dismantle and destroy de jure Jim Crow. But what I think is really exciting to remember is a lot of those organizations, kind of boots on the ground in the South, were based in the North and had active operations here. So a really good example is the Congress of Racial Equality. So this was a interracial, student-led organization that was founded in Chicago but moved its headquarters to New York in 1948. And they're the ones who are the kind of vanguard of the freedom rides, most notably in 1961 in the South. But they had 10 branches in New York City. And what's really exciting about those 10 branches is they're all doing intensely local work within their distinct communities. Like, I'm doing this wild research project right now about how the Bronx branch, which is also like the Bronx Branch, that's where Stokely Carmichael comes out of. They were trying to force, this is so wild, White Castle restaurants in the Bronx to hire more Black and Puerto Rican workers. They were holding sit-ins at White Castles in the Bronx, right? So, but they could be highly local in who they were targeting, right? And we sort of think, right, yeah, there's not a kind of explicit bar on hiring Black workers as there would be at a White Castle in the South, but right, the same problems, the same profound violations of, at that point, right, the Civil Rights Act were happening. So on the Lower East Side, so the Lower East Side branch of CORE, their headquarters were on Delancey and Allen. And I think kind of connecting this all notably, the white Jewish civil rights worker Mickey Schwerner, who was murdered by the Klan and the police in Mississippi in 1964, that was his branch. Right, so we can kind of understand these things as connected. But what the Lower East Side branch of CORE was doing is, kind of tragically tackling the same issues that persist in this neighborhood today. Police brutality, first and foremost, racism and police brutality in the NYPD, discrimination in housing. One of the main things they would do is send a white couple to look at an apartment and then send a Black couple to look at the apartment and make records of who the landlord responded to. And then similarly, right, fighting to get, Black and Puerto Rican workers at construction sites, right? Fighting the unions, getting the unions to end either informal or formal segregation. So we see this attention at the local level, the sense of sort of what does the neighborhood need, all the things afforded within a human rights framework. And there is a little bit of, we see the collaboration with other local organizations, other entities like Henry Street in, we need a place to hold a meeting, even, right? We need to get the word out. And then I think also people learning from programs that were already or would be offered by Henry Street, whether it is after school care, whether it is like hot lunch programs, whether it is finding ways to reach, the most kind of nefarious networks of landlords in the neighborhood. So again, I think just this focus on the neighborhood is really key. And then the last thing I'll say, the kind of the spirit of that civil rights era, impacts, federal legislation ultimately, but not just in an explicitly civil rights and voting rights vein. The kind of immense pressure put on the federal government is a huge reason for the passage of the Hart-Celler Act, which was in 1965, which overturned the most longstanding and very explicitly race-based exclusionary immigration policy in the United States. So post 1965, that's when you see, immigrants from all around the world who had previously been explicitly barred from the United States under a racist quota system coming to this country, right? So much more immigration coming from Central and South America, from the Caribbean, from Africa, and from Asia and Southeast Asia, right? So sort of 65, we also see that's a moment when new residents to this neighborhood are also going to start to change because of this kind of spirit of revolutionary change that the government was forced to enact to a certain degree.
Thank you. Do you want to
say one quick thing? I just learned this reading the book, but Seller of Hart Seller, yes, was actually the person who brought the grant that was responsible for the Abrams Art Center redesign and building to Henry Street. So that history is like really connected. And then just one of the local struggles that Mobilization for Youth, well, I think this is on our agenda, but one of the big struggles that they had mobilized these mothers to fight for, and that mothers said that they needed, was the ability for public school children in the Lower East Side to get textbooks that they could take home. That wasn't something that the schools here offered, and I think there really was a belief among some teachers, unfortunately, that the students who were going to school here were unteachable, that there was no point in investing in them. And something that's really important, I think, about those local struggles is it gives people a channel to say, that's not true. I'm challenging that kind of foundational assumption, and then asking for a specific resource that will make things better. So Henry Street is sort of the container for that sort of like radical action to happen, even though there are disagreements about what programs matter. Debbie, hearing you talk, in the records all the time, some of the activists who are new to Mobilization for Youth will say, oh, Henry Street, they're the old guard. They're really just really doing a lot of recreation programs, not making real change. But I think I can even hear that those recreation programs are part of how we make real change, right? That's how communities come together. So just couldn't resist.
You know, I'm happy, and I'm happy to hear that you say like they were fighting for books, because now it makes sense to me, because the rally was at the school around the corner, so it just like clicked. Yeah, so it might have been that rally that my mother attended. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that.
So cool. Thank you so much. So 1967 is when Helen Hall, our second director, retired. And again, she had been director for 34 years, so a big slice of Henry Street's history. Helen's house is named after Helen Hall. And the social worker who took over next as leader was Bertram Beck, and he led Mobilization for Youth. And Bertram Beck is kind of known for striving to include the community more fully in the settlement, in decision-making, including a growing Black population in the neighborhood and growing Latino population and growing Chinese populations. And I'll just mention some of the things that happened at Henry Street in the early 70s. This is, Salonee's gonna talk more about this in just a minute, this major financial crisis that New York is going through at this time, but there's actually quite an expansion of programming happening at Henry Street in the 70s. We actually had a panel for Come to the Table a few months ago with Woody King Jr. He started the New Federal Theater at Henry Street in 1970, and this was a theater company that was meant to showcase Black playwrights and actors and people of color and women, those who had been marginalized from a traditional theater scene, and that started at Henry Street in 1970. Also, there was a huge expansion of the arts in general at Henry Street. Our whole wing of what's now the Abrams Art Center was built in 1975, and it was called the Arts for Living Center, which is like a very cool name, right? Arts for Living Center. So they got this huge wing in 1975. And then also 1972 was the start of our Urban Family Center, and this was the first family shelter that connected families to social services. So it was a very innovative model. So a lot going on at Henry Street in the 70s and this expansion of programs. But I want, keep that in mind as Salonee talks about this major crisis that New York City is going through. I wanted Salonee to give a little bit of context for this crisis, how it kind of came about, how the city responded. Do you mind doing that now?
Sure, and I'm going to try and be succinct. But I mean, I'm sure many of you lived through the 1975 fiscal crisis. You might remember the kind of famous headline, Ford to City drop dead in the New York Daily News. That's sort of the like image I think of when I think about it, because it is a crisis that is happening in many ways all around the country, right? Many different cities are debt financed at the time. They're running their municipal budgets based on borrowing money. But New York City really is made into an example by many of the banks that are loaning them money as a city that's gone too far in its social service mission. It's become too much of a social democracy. And many of the programs we were just talking about, like Mobilization for Youth or legal services, groups of parents really pushing school boards to think about the kinds of students they're serving and what their needs are. City College is free and has open admissions for the first time. New York City has a rent control program, or a rent stabilization program by that point, that many cities around the country have repealed. So New York is sort of this bastion of a different sort of social democracy that there's big backlash to by the 1970s. So in 1975, many of the banks that hold the city's debt call it in. They say, you have to pay us back by this deadline. The city's about to go bankrupt, and they appoint a group of basically bankers, unelected bankers, known as the Emergency Fiscal Control Board, to decide what programs are going to be cut and what services need to end, basically. And they make massive cuts, specifically around the Health and Hospitals Corporation. They raise the subway fare. They start charging tuition at CUNY. There's all of these things. Free daycare goes away. There are daycare programs that are eliminated. Benefits that I think we would be shocked if we really think about that people really had are kind of clawed back in that 1975 moment. And the piece of it that I always find most jarring is that several city planners and administrators kind of repeat what we saw with redlining, where they designate certain neighborhoods as targets for planned shrinkage. So that's a kind of strange bureaucratic phrase that essentially means they're going to stop sending fire trucks and stop doing garbage collection and reduce police presence in certain neighborhoods, in the hope that the people who live there will simply leave. And so those are areas like the Lower East Side, like the South Bronx, areas that are basically designated as not worthy of municipal resources, and the folks that live there are just going to have to fend for themselves or find something else to do. So when I hear that Henry Street's starting something in 1972, Urban Family Center, something like that, that's very much pushing against the tide of that sort of retrenchment. And in the 60s, we had seen something kind of interesting. Henry Street had always been funded through, private philanthropy up until the 50s and the 60s, when you really start getting the state involved. And suddenly there are these government grant programs, there are state welfare resources. That's sort of what the battle turns into in 1975, is if the state, that same what does the state owe its people question, there's sort of a renegotiation that is happening. And I'll say one other quick thing is that I'm really a housing historian at heart, but in 1979, the Coalition for the Homeless wins a really big case against the city that basically guarantees a right to shelter. It's something that's being debated hotly now, but it's not until the mid-'80s that families are actually granted a right to shelter, right? So that first right to shelter in 1979 only applies to single men. The city's only obligated to provide shelter to them. So having an urban family center or a family shelter is a rare resource in 1972. That's kind of unheard of in the landscape of even how officials in charge of providing housing to people are imagining who's in need of it.
Thank you so much. Really good context. So I was looking at the time, we have so much history to go through. I'm sorry, we're coming up on time. Okay, we're gonna go a little bit over, but I am gonna be respectful of your time. I know some of you have to go to meetings. If you do need to slip out, that's totally fine. We will understand. But we'll try to move through our last few questions. So, I've mentioned we were in Bertram Beck era. And there was actually in the early 80s a lot of changeover in leadership at Henry Street. So Nathan Allen was here as the director from 1980 to 1982. And then actually we had 3 directors in the span of 3 years right after that. And then Danny Cronenfeld took over, who had been the head of the Urban Family Center, and he became director of Henry Street in 1985 and was director for a long time here. So I want to turn to Debbie. You were very active at Henry Street in the 80s and 90s, and can you tell us about some of the programs you led? And after you finish talking, or I can cycle through some of the pictures while you're talking, let me know how you want to go. But I'd love to hear about your experiences in the 80s and 90s.
Oh, for sure. I'm going to start because I know I'm going to rush through this. And like me and my sister's here, Kim, she reminded me, like, when we first started, I thought I started in the Pioneer Organization, which I'll share in a minute. But it was a girls' club, right? So Henry Street had a lot of girls' program back in the 80s. And I think me and my sister took advantage of all of them. But one of them was a girls' club. And out of that, we were cheerleaders, right? Henry Street had one of the biggest basketball program in all of New York City. So we called it the Cage, like West 4th Street have the Cage. We called the Cage on Henry Street. Everybody came from all over, a lot of tournaments. We don't have it anymore, and I wish that we can get to see that happen again. Yeah, so me and my sister, we were cheerleaders, and what we did was we had to buy our own sweatshirt, and we ironed on a big H. And I promise, someone have that picture, and I promise that I can share it one day.
Yeah, please.
Share it one day. But after that, and I said, like James H. Robinson, who was the chief administrator back in the days, they had this leadership program. And he was like, Debbie, I want you to be a part of this program. And I was like, no. It was a competition, the cheerleaders versus the pioneers. And so he was like, no, I want you to be a part of it. So I went through the training. And it was, you had to get up 8 o'clock. We did PT training in this park right here, which we call 134, but now it's known as Salonee. We had a curfew. We had to wear the same uniforms. And it was like counselors in training, leadership, just core values. And then you graduated from that program. And then once you graduated from that program, you become mentors. But once I graduated from that program, I was then given the job to then train 7 of those lines. So, and then I do have a pioneer that went through my line sitting here. And I failed to mention that in after-school program, I had Eileen in my program back then. So that was special times back then. So a lot of those programs, I led that for 7 years. But then I think what's my fondest memory was we established a cadet corps program. We were a sister to the Duensing Cadet Corps program that was based in Harlem. And so I took that, I was asked to take that training. And so from there, I graduated being a sergeant. So coming back and then really developing a curriculum to have cadet corps program at Henry Street. And I did that for several years from, I forgot what year, 1982 to the 90s. And that was a very special program. They had to wear uniforms, really military style, but incorporating, their skills to be like, I have it written down. I'm gonna a senior moment right now. Citizen services and really developing themselves to be respectful. You came inside 301, you went, you saluted the front desk. Anybody that walked in Henry Street had to take their hats off. So it was really grounded, right? Really grounded. And so I did Cadet Corps for that many years. It was such a joy to have those programs and lead that. And then from that time, James H. Robinson passed away in 1989, just really a void in my heart and this community's heart. And so, okay, hopefully. So when he passed away, I made a promise to myself that I'm going to always carry that torch of leadership in his honor. And that's why I'm still here at Henry Street today. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you, Debbie.
Got that out. But Jim Robinson is the man that really pushed me to continue because I had my son when I was 22 and working in his office, and he was like, when I had, somebody forced me to tell him that I was pregnant and having a baby, I wasn't going to tell him. It was going to be a surprise because nobody knew that I was pregnant. I had to tell him in October. I had my baby in November. And so when I told him, he took me in the office and he cried. And he was like, that means you're never coming back. And I made a promise to him. They only gave us 6 weeks of maternity leave. But I made a promise to him, I will be back. And so I'm still here today. So I just want to say that. There was a lot of other programs that we had going on. Still band, box. It was just, like I said, a Disney of programs at Henry Street. And I think for me, I got a lot out of Henry Street. And I want this community to get that same love and caring services that I got. And I think that's why I go so hard for this agency. And I'm sorry, I know it's going to be a crybaby, but
I think people really feel your
it's
care
in my
here.
heart. Henry Street's in my heart, in my vein. And I consider it a second home. Everybody here is my family. If ever you need something, I'm there for you. And I have such an amazing staff now, and we get to do this work. And I know my staff has heard this story plenty of times, and I'm like, you guys are going to be the next leader once I retire. Once I retire, but they're going to carry that torch. I'm going to pass the torch to them. But and today we have a group of community response team, and thanks to David for bringing that program to Henry Street, where we go out and do a lot of community work. And I know they'd be like, why we got to do this? Why we got to do that? But it's important. Because at one point, people were saying they don't know about Henry Street, right? And so now I think that spark is back, and I give it all to the props to David Garza, who, my partner, who, and I know we're going to go over time, who I can go and I say there's a need in this community, and David Garza will find the resources for us to do that, to really provide that services. So, yeah, thank you for giving me that time.
Thank you. That was beautiful, Debbie. Everything you were saying about how much you care about the community, we know that. People who work here, we feel that. So thank you for sharing your memories. And Debbie, I guess we won't have time to really talk through each photo, but do you mind if I cycle through and you can say what it is?
Sure.
Yep.
Oh, wait, let me come on. Oh, I'm going to be in people's way. Okay, so, that's me. This is in 1982. We were going to have a special visitor come to Henry Street. And so I was like, okay, this person's coming to Henry Street. He's very important. We need to have a sign that says, welcome to Henry Street. Back then, 301 was called Youth Services, so this sign here, it's me and one of the participants, and we're filling it in because whoever wrote the sign, you couldn't read it. So here we are filling it in, and it says Henry Street Settlement, Youth Services, welcome Governor Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton came to Henry Street and held a town hall right on the steps of the Abrams Arts Center. And so there was a lot of community members, and he was talking, and then I think he announced that he was running for president. So that's that picture, yes. Okay, so this photo is a photo of when we incorporated girls program at BGR. And so we did our first girls program then. So that's me and my sister and a couple of the girls. It was called Kids Kitchen. And then, of course, remember that list of jobs I said I had? So I don't know if you know what this is 301 Henry Street, and I'm at the front desk. And this was probably late at night because I didn't have a 9 to 5. I had probably a 9 to midnight. Anything that needed to be done, Debbie stayed until I had my family. Then it was only to 10 o'clock at night And then here it is with me doing the cadets. And this is in 301's gym. And this was in like 1983, 84 maybe. And if you can see in the back, we had steel drums, so we learned how to play steel drums. So that's that picture there. And we did a lot of competition. We went to West Point, and we did a performance at Madison Square Garden. But when we went to West Point, we came in 3rd place. Okay, so of course, this is like rehearsal with the Cadet Corps program, and I failed to say, so Henry Street, when we used the gym, half of the gym was for cadets, half of the gym was for Double Dutch. Any space that they had, we had programs in it. And then this is, okay, the white and red, that's me. And this is when I graduated from the Pioneer program. And this was in 1981. And this is us doing the bomba. And then this, and community days are my specialty. I enjoy doing that. So this is a community day event that we used to put on at Henry Street back in the days. And so these are some of the pictures that I found. And so we also had vendors, so you can pay $25. If you wanted to sell stuff, you can come and pay $25, and that's how we raise money, doing fundraisers. We did cake sales, and we needed to buy somebody a cadet uniform if they didn't have it, so it was a lot of fundraising. And this was right here in Soul Lane Park. So now CRTs, you'll see why we continue to do this work, right? Mm-hmm. In a bigger scale, though. Thank you, David.
That's
that
the
it?
last one I have.
Okay, so that's it, yeah.
But you have a lot more in your archives,
Oh, I
which
have
are
a lot
incredible.
more. If anybody want to see pictures, I have them in my office. You can please stop by. And if you want to hear more about my story, I'm sorry, I got emotional. But if anybody want to come and talk to me, my door's always open. I'm in 269 Henry Street, 301. And if anybody wants to volunteer at our community events, please do so.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Okay, everyone, again, I'll repeat, if you need to run, I understand, that's totally fine. I have one more question for Salonee, just to bring us up to the present, and then I will wrap up. So Salonee, I've heard you've mentioned it during this panel too, how there's so many incredible examples at Henry Street of responding in the face of crises. And in the 1980s, there was a major conservative backlash and cuts to social programs nationwide. And then also, in the late 1980s and 1990s, Henry Street responded to the AIDS crisis and mobilized even before the government acknowledged the problem or mobilized as a government. Henry Street was there. So I was just wondering if you can talk quickly about a few of those examples.
Yes, and I'm going to be really quick, but something that's really amazing about Henry Street from that Great Depression era we were talking about to the AIDS crisis is that I think looking at how Henry Street responds really shows us how history sometimes happens from the bottom up. Henry Street, in the House on Henry Street and in various documents, saw the signs of HIV/AIDS in the community much earlier than the CDC did. They were documenting the kinds of ways that people were getting sick in the 70s. They were sort of aware that this crisis was coming. The Community Consultation Center is one of the first to offer family services. They do outreach in New York City public schools. They offer counseling services for children who've lost a parent, which I can't quite describe how, if you think about how the rest of the country is thinking about HIV/AIDS, they're often thinking about it as this problem that's only affecting gay men in certain places. They're imagining places like the West Village or Los Angeles in some cases, or San Francisco. There's this very small and narrow vision of who's affected by this crisis that allows a lot of people to dismiss it as not important or not likely to affect them. And Henry Street is really one of those places that doesn't exclude gay people by any means from the services they're offering, but is sort of thinking about HIV as something that's affecting families, that's affecting children, that's affecting women, that's also thinking about people who use drugs, not as bad people who we can't help, but community members and neighbors deserving of empathy and services. So there's a lot that's happening here that I think is fairly unique anywhere in the country, especially in terms of like bringing together housing and social work and mental health care in one place and really thinking about people as whole people. It's kind of a model that I think if other places had adopted, we would remember the HIV/AIDS crisis differently too. That's my brief answer.
Yeah, no, thank you. And there's actually it's almost like a short book that's on Henry Street's website that was written by 3 social workers who worked at the Community Consultation Center during that time and, recounting their experiences and how innovative Henry Street was in responding. So you can learn more about that. And so I'm just gonna wrap us up. We've talked all the way up till the 90s. Of course, there's 25 years of amazing history, or 30 years since then. Henry Street has been, we've mentioned this multiple times, so adept at jumping in moments of crises, after 9/11, shifting our workforce programs and starting the Workforce Development Center. Verona Middleton Jeter was our director at that time. David Garza has helped this organization move through multiple crises as well, Hurricane Sandy and the COVID pandemic, and Henry Street has just always been like on the front lines already, and so is poised to be able to jump in at these moments. And, I've really noticed under David's leadership, I think he talks so much about integration of all of our programs. I know that's been a big push, and I've seen a huge change in that since I've even been here for 7 years. And also just this community engagement piece that Debbie is such a huge part of, right? I've seen in my past 7 years just so many more Lower East Siders in leadership positions at Henry Street, and I think that's unique for a large nonprofit organization to be that connected to the community, and a lot of that I attribute to Debbie for sure, with being the VP of Community Engagement and Integration. So we are going to wrap up. I think, I don't know if we have time for a Q&A. Maybe we should just informally kind of like if you have questions for our panelists, what do you all think? Do you want to say, we should wrap up? Do you want to say something?
Yeah, so first of all, round of applause for Katie. With our 3rd out of 4 coming. Thank you so much, Katie. You truly help us embrace our history. But another really notable move to hire a public historian for Henry Street. We're one of the only settlements that has it. I'll close us with this because the question was asked to Debbie, and I certainly will always share acknowledgement, publicly and privately with Debbie and how much I respect your work. But each of you, that holds true for Shayna and Kelly and John and Tim and Ida and Eileen. I share platitudes and Connie and Rich and Ellen with any one of you and every one of you all the time. But the question was, what makes Henry Street different? And I'll say this, because of our work, other organizations, other local settlements, I won't name the 2 settlements, but 2 other settlements in the last 6 months have come to us. We won't name them. They've come to us and they say, how do you do it? How do you do it? And to me, it's not a secret, right? Blood, sweat, tears, and money. Blood, sweat, tears, and money.
Ching-ching.
Blood, no, it's not. But the blood, because sometimes the work is dangerous and we're willing to do it anyway. The sweat, because we're willing to work hard. The tears, because we care. And the money, because if you don't resource a function, you don't get it. So if you want the function of community engagement, you resource a department and you get it. It's about us. That's why a budget is a value statement. But what I think, hearing the totality of the 90 years, and I'm just fortunate enough to serve in this role. We've had really 6 executive directors in our history, because the three in 3 years, they can't really count because it takes you a year to find out where you are, right? So 6 in 130 years. That's an awesome responsibility, and I see it as stewardship. Just don't try to maintain what came before us. But what I think sets us apart is the trust. The community trusts that we're going to respond in crisis. But the reason they trust that we're going to respond in crisis is because they trust that we're going to respond in the day-to-day. The COVID makes the headlines, but the day-to-day makes the foundation of the organization. So I would say it's the trust. It's that inextricably woven trust. But with that trust, it's whatever Spider-Man, trust comes responsibility. If there's a trust to steward, That means we have to open the door when the door, gets knocked on. We have to respond in crisis. But that's all of you, because we don't have 18. We have like 650 doors of trust that when someone knocks, like the trusted response has to come back. So it's that shared responsibility of trust. So thank you for shining the light on it so meaningfully. Round of applause for all the panelists. And anyone who wants that, certainly we can, and a round of applause for all of you. The trust.